Hey there. Tonight, we are going to travel far back into a world where the sun did not simply rise on its own every morning. We are going to explore a dark, ancient truth where the entire universe was constantly teetering on the very edge of total annihilation. We will look closely at a civilization that believed they had to physically recreate the world every single day just to keep the endless freezing void at bay. We will witness secret ceremonies where men simulated drowning in dark waters and where organs were pulled from bodies while the heavy beating heart was left behind to face the ultimate judgment in the dark. If you find peace in these ancient shadows and the slow, heavy rituals of the distant past, please leave a like and subscribe to let me know you are resting here with me. Tell me where you are listening from tonight, and let us find comfort together in the quiet dark. Now it is time to let the heavy burdens of the long day fall completely away. Dim the lights in your room until only the softest and quietest shadows remain against the walls. Let your tired body sink deep into the heavy mattress beneath you. Breathe in slowly and feel the cool, clean air completely fill the deepest spaces of your lungs. Breathe out and let your tense jaw soften and drop slightly. Unclench your hands and let your fingers curl naturally on the soft fabric of your bed. Let the profound silence of the room wrap around your shoulders like a thick, heavy linen blanket. You are entirely safe here in this quiet space. The outside world cannot reach you now. Honestly, I have always found it strange that we take the simple sunrise completely for granted today. You know that specific feeling when you wake up in the pitch dark of the early morning and the house is entirely silent, and for a single disorienting second, you completely forget exactly where you are and who you are. That fleeting moment of dark confusion is the exact void the ancient Egyptian priests feared every single night of their lives. They believed with absolute certainty that the ordered world was an incredibly fragile illusion. They believed that the natural state of the universe was a terrifying, boundless ocean of dark, chaotic water known as Nun. Imagine that ancient, infinite water for a moment. It is a dark, limitless ocean stretching out in every possible direction forever. There is no surface and there is no floor. There is no light and there is no sound. There is no heat and there is no cold. It is just the heavy, suffocating weight of endless potential waiting in the absolute dark. The ancient people believed that before the earth or the sky or the gods ever existed, there was only this terrifying, silent water. Out of this unimaginable void, a single spark of pure, desperate will suddenly forced itself into existence. This was the great creator god named Atum. He emerged from the dark, crushing water through an act of sheer, monumental effort. He pushed himself upward and formed the very first mound of solid, dark earth, rising above the cosmic flood. This single agonizing moment of spontaneous generation became the absolute blueprint for every single sacred responsibility that the ancient humans carried on their shoulders. Some scholars argue today that the elaborate temple rituals were just symbolic pageantry designed to control the masses. But if you look closely at the sheer massive scale of their stone temples and the paranoid perfection of their daily ceremonies, you quickly realize they truly believed they were physically holding the fragile universe together with their bare hands. They knew that the dark waters of Nun were always waiting patiently at the edges of the world, ready to swallow the light and return everything to the silent, crushing void. The world required daily human intervention to simply exist. Long before the massive pyramids were ever carved from the desert rock, the ancient priests built temporary shallow pools within the wide open courtyards of their early temples. The air in the deep hours of the night was bitterly cold, and it carried the faint, sharp smell of the distant river mud. The priests walked silently across the smooth limestone floors with their bare feet. The cold stone pressed against their skin and grounded them in the physical reality of the waking world. They wore simple garments of pure white linen that rustled softly with every slow, deliberate step they took. They filled the shallow courtyard's pools with fresh, dark water drawn directly from the Nile River. This water had been heavily consecrated through long, complex incantations whispered into the clay jars during the darkest part of the night. These artificial pools became the literal stage for the most important ritual in the history of human existence. A single priest was chosen to represent the great creator god Atum. His physical body was carefully anointed with thick, fragrant oils that smelled of crushed lotus flowers and ancient desert resins. The oil made his bare skin gleam softly in the ambient starlight. He waded slowly and silently into the freezing cold water of the artificial pool. The water rose up to his waist and then up to his chest. He stood perfectly still in the dark water and waited for the exact, precise moment of cosmic alignment. The physical act of rising from the sacred waters required an absolutely terrifying level of careful astronomical timing. High above the temple walls, the master astronomers stood on the flat stone roofs and stared intensely into the black, glittering sky. They tracked the slow, silent movement of the heavy constellations across the heavens. They held small wooden instruments and measured the exact angles of the glowing stars. The air was thick with agonizing anticipation. The astronomers were calculating the absolute precise microsecond when specific bright stars would perfectly cross the eastern horizon. These specific celestial markers represented the exact cosmic conditions that originally accompanied the very first moment of creation. The tension in the cold night air was so thick and so heavy, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the chests of the waiting men. If they missed the proper timing by even a single breath, they believed, the sun would simply refuse to rise and the endless dark water would consume them all. Finally, the lead astronomer lowered his wooden instrument and gave a single silent hand signal to the waiting priests below. The chosen priest, standing deep in the freezing water, began to slowly and agonizingly push himself upward. His smooth, oiled skin broke the surface of the dark water, just as the very first faint gray light of the approaching dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky. As he moved, his limbs synchronized perfectly with the slow turning of the massive ancient stars above his head. The other members of the clergy, arranged tightly around the edges of the dark pool, began to open their mouths and chant. They did not simply sing or speak. They chanted the ancient primordial utterances that gave physical form to the formless dark. These sacred, heavy syllables represented much more than mere human words. They physically embodied the raw, violent, creative force that transformed empty potential into hard reality. The priests truly understood that sound itself possessed a massive generative power. The specific deep vibrations produced by their throats could physically recreate the exact conditions present at the violent birth of the world. The most sacred of these heavy incantations began with a low, deep hum that vibrated the very bones in their chests. They chanted the words of the God who came into being by his own absolute will. The low, hypnotic sound swelled and grew louder in the cold morning air. The voices of the men wove tightly together to create complex harmonic patterns that physically resonated with the massive stone architecture of the surrounding temple. The huge sandstone columns and the thick, heavy walls were specifically designed and perfectly positioned by ancient master architects to capture and amplify these sacred sounds. The sound waves bounced back and forth across the open courtyard and created powerful standing waves of acoustic energy. The very air inside the temple began to hum and vibrate with the heavy physical weight of the spoken magic. The training process to master this specific vocal technique took many long decades of grueling silent practice. The novice priests spent their entire youth learning how to perfectly control their lung capacity and their deep diaphragm muscles. They learned to produce specific tonal qualities that perfectly matched the cosmic frequencies present at the dawn of creation. During the absolute climax of the ceremony, the high priest stood alone at the massive eastern entrance of the temple. He faced the brightening horizon while holding a heavy golden scepter tightly in his hands. The heavy gold caught the very first piercing ray of the morning sun and reflected the blinding light directly back into the dark temple courtyard. As the burning golden disk of the sun finally appeared above the distant desert sands, the high priest began his own sacred recitation. His voice started as a soft, dry whisper that sounded like wind blowing across loose sand. The whisper gradually increased in volume and complexity until it became a booming, powerful roar that commanded the very elements of nature. Each spoken phrase built heavily upon the previous one and created a massive, invisible verbal architecture that mirrored the complex, layered construction of the physical cosmos itself. The words described the violent separation of the hard earth from the deep water. They commanded the heavy sky to lift itself far above the ground. They ordered the bright light to violently cleave the endless darkness into pieces. "I am the one who came forth from the dark water," the high priest intoned, with a voice that echoed like rolling thunder. "I am the one who created the names of the limbs, and thus came into being the gods." These specific ancient phrases were not considered beautiful metaphorical poetry by the men who spoke them. They were the literal, mechanical instructions for operating the universe. They were the exact code required to keep the sun burning and the earth spinning in the vast empty void. As the chanting finally reached its peak, the bright morning sun completely cleared the horizon and bathed the entire temple in a blinding wash of pure golden light. The cold, dark water in the artificial pool sparkled brilliantly, and the shivering, oiled skin of the emerging priest warmed under the heavy rays of the sun. The terrifying void had been successfully pushed back for one more single day. The heavy, crushing burden of creation had been carried successfully by the fragile human voices of the dedicated men. They breathed a long, collective sigh of deep, profound relief and lowered their tired heads in the warm light. The daily battle against the dark chaos was over for now, but they knew deep in their tired souls that the infinite water was always waiting out there in the dark. The cycle would inevitably begin again when the sun finally sank below the western hills. The world was safe for the moment, and the gentle warmth of the morning sun began to bake the cold desert sand. You can feel that same gentle, radiating warmth slowly spreading across your own tired limbs right now. The heavy darkness of the long night is completely harmless to you here. The boundaries of your own quiet world are perfectly secure, and the deep calm of the morning light is waiting patiently for you on the other side of your sleep. The daily recreation of the world inside the safe stone walls of the temple was a quiet and intensely controlled defense against the creeping dark. But there was another massive cosmic event that required a much larger and far more chaotic human intervention. The gentle shift from the daily dawn rituals to the massive, terrifying, and life-giving annual flood of the great river changed the entire physical landscape of the ancient world. The long, brutal heat of the desert summer would build up relentlessly for many agonizing months. The dry, cracked earth of the riverbanks would bake under the punishing rays of the burning sun. The green plants would wither and turn to dry brown dust. The animals would grow thin and desperate for the taste of fresh water. The entire civilization would hold its collective breath and wait patiently for the heavy tears of the goddess Isis to finally fall from the sky. The ancient people believed that the great flood of the Nile River was not simply a natural weather phenomenon. They believed the rising water was the literal physical manifestation of the goddess Isis, weeping endlessly for her murdered and dismembered husband Osiris. Her profound divine grief was so incredibly massive and so entirely overwhelming that her flowing tears swelled the ancient river until it violently burst its dry, dusty banks. The flood prediction ceremonies began many long months before the actual dark water ever arrived. The exhausted priest astronomers stood on the high temple roofs and used their deep knowledge of the stellar positions to carefully calculate the exact timing of the coming deluge. They watched specifically for the bright flickering appearance of the dog star Sirius low on the eastern horizon just before the dawn. When the bright blue star finally appeared, they knew the heavy weeping of the goddess had officially begun. The arrival of the floodwaters was an incredibly overwhelming sensory experience. You could hear the deep rushing sound of the massive water moving toward you long before you could actually see it. It sounded like a low, rumbling earthquake tearing across the dry desert floor. Then the smell would hit you. It was the incredibly rich, pungent, and deeply intoxicating smell of wet, fertile river mud mixed with crushed green reeds and ancient decaying stones. The dark brown water would come surging violently over the dry, cracked earth and swallow the empty fields completely whole. The flood transformed the familiar dry landscape into a massive, shimmering inland sea that stretched as far as the human eye could possibly see. This massive inundation provided the absolute most dramatic opportunity for the entire community to participate in the grand recreation of the primordial waters and the renewal of the cosmos. Unlike the secret, quiet daily creation rituals performed hidden within the dark temple walls, the massive Nile flood ceremonies involved thousands of ordinary people in a grand theatrical reenactment of the birth of the world. As the dark, muddy waters began to rise and cover the land, the dedicated priests would quickly construct temporary open-air temples on highly elevated stone platforms that would purposefully remain just above the rushing water line. These temporary wooden structures were built rapidly from light materials that could be easily assembled and completely disassembled as the heavy waters shifted and moved. The architecture of these flood temples featured open wooden channels and shallow stone pools that connected directly to the rising river. The ingenious design allowed the violent, muddy floodwaters to flow continuously right through the middle of the sacred ritual space, while still maintaining the strictly controlled environment necessary for the proper ceremonial procedures. As the heavy, dark waters reached their absolute peak depth, the priests would begin to construct massive artificial islands directly in the middle of the rushing current. They used heavy baskets of wet sand and large limestone blocks to build the mounds higher and higher. They timed the completion of these islands to perfectly coincide with specific, crucial astronomical events passing overhead in the night sky. These temporary wetland masses physically represented the very first Earth that ever appeared above the cosmic waters of Nun. Their creation required intense, precise physical coordination between multiple teams of sweating, exhausted ritual specialists working waist-deep in the rushing mud. The precise moment when the top of the artificial wet mound finally broke through the surface of the swirling brown water triggered the absolute most sacred portion of the entire massive ceremony. A high priest, representing the creator god Atum, would slowly wade through the heavy rushing floodwaters toward the newly formed muddy island. His difficult, slow progress against the strong river current was marked by the loud, rhythmic chanting of creation, hymns sung by hundreds of voices on the distant shores. The loud chanting described the original difficult journey of the god, rising from the crushing depths of the void. Upon finally reaching the wet, muddy mound, The exhausted, dripping priest would carefully perform specific grand gestures that symbolically separated the heavy elements of the world. He would slowly raise his wet arms high above his head to establish the permanent physical boundary between the wet earth and the open sky. His bare feet remained planted firmly and deeply in the sacred soft mud of the new ground. The rushing flood waters themselves became highly active participants in the sacred ritual through the careful, clever manipulation of their chaotic flow patterns. The priest engineers used temporary wooden dams and woven reed channels to physically direct the violent movement of the water. They created beautiful, massive, swirling currents that spiraled perfectly around the ceremonial islands in sacred geometric patterns that exactly matched the cosmic forces present at the dawn of creation. While the massive, loud flood ceremonies raged outside in the bright sun, the heart of the ancient religion remained deeply hidden in the claustrophobic, intensely intimate, dark, inner sanctuaries of the permanent stone temples. The role of the high temple priests extended far beyond the loud public ceremonial pageantry. They understood themselves as the literal active caretakers of the actual living gods. Each morning, long before the dawn, the priests would begin the incredibly complex and terrifying process of physically awakening the resident deity of the temple. The ceremony started in the absolute, complete, pitch-black darkness of the inner temple corridors. The thick, heavy stone walls blocked out all natural light and all outside sound. The silence in the deep sanctuary was so profound and so absolute that the priests could hear the heavy beating of their own anxious hearts echoing in their chests. The high priest would move very slowly through the massive stone corridors, carrying a single small flickering oil lamp in his trembling hand. The tiny yellow flame provided the only weak illumination in the crushing dark. The warm light created tall, terrifying dancing shadows that stretched across the ancient walls. The walls were completely covered from floor to ceiling, with deeply carved hieroglyphic inscriptions that watched the priest silently as he passed. This walk through the absolute darkness physically represented the primordial void that existed before the very first sunrise. The priest was carefully recreating the terrifying journey from non-being into living existence. The actual awakening ritual required multiple priests working together in a very carefully coordinated sequence of slow, deliberate movements. The first priest would slowly approach the massive, sealed wooden doors of the naos. The naos was the central inner shrine that housed the actual physical statue of the great god. The heavy wooden doors were firmly locked and sealed with a lump of hard-dried clay. The priest carried a heavy, solid golden key that had been intensely consecrated through specific whispered incantations during the night. The slow, hesitant sound of the heavy golden key turning in the ancient metal lock was the loudest sound in the silent room. The sharp snap of the dry clay seal breaking open echoed sharply against the cold stone walls. The physical act of unlocking the heavy sanctuary doors perfectly represented the cracking open of the cosmic egg from which the universe originally emerged. As the heavy wooden doors swung slowly outward on their bronze hinges, the priest would whisper the sacred words of awakening. He would peer into the dark, dusty space of the shrine and see the cold, hard statue of the god waiting in the shadows. The statues of the major deities were typically carved from incredibly dense, heavy black granite or dark, smooth basalt. These specific hard stones were deeply associated with absolute permanence and terrifying divine authority. The god was considered to be deeply asleep and needed to be woken very gently and incredibly respectfully. The priests believed with absolute certainty that the cold stone statue actually contained the real living consciousness of the divine being. The eyes of the dark statue were beautifully inlaid with polished white crystal and sharp black obsidian that caught the weak light of the oil lamp and created the terrifying illusion of actual living sight. The dark god was looking directly back at the trembling priest. The morning bathing ritual that immediately followed the awakening was an act of profound, intimate devotion. It required fresh water that had been specially prepared through long overnight purification ceremonies. This specific water was drawn blindly from the deep sacred temple wells that connected directly to the underground streams believed to originate from the primordial waters of creation. The cold well water was carefully filtered through clean white sand and purifying natron salt to remove any tiny impurities that might offend the delicate sensibilities of the waking god. The temperature of the water was carefully regulated using hot stones until it perfectly matched the exact gentle warmth of living human flesh. The priests truly understood that their divine charge possessed real physical sensory awareness despite its hard stone composition. The actual bathing process involved multiple priests working in a slow, coordinated, silent sequence. One priest would gently pour the warm, consecrated water from a golden pitcher, while another priest used incredibly soft white linen cloths to carefully cleanse the dark stone surface of the statue. Their slow wiping movements followed strictly prescribed ancient patterns that ensured every single part of the divine form received proper, respectful attention. The careful washing began at the smooth head of the statue and proceeded slowly downward in a very systematic fashion. Particular intense care was given to the carved face and the hands and the feet, because these were the specific body parts most actively involved in the divine interaction with the physical world. The heavy whetstone gleamed beautifully in the dim light of the sanctuary. After the warm bath came the anointing of the god. The special thick oils used for this process were compounded heavily according to secret recipes preserved in the deepest temple libraries. The ingredients included incredibly rare, sticky resins imported at great cost from distant desert lands. The most precious of these heavy, thick oils contained rich frankincense and dark, bitter myrrh. These specific aromatic substances were believed to actively attract the divine attention and firmly maintain the powerful presence of the god within the cold stone vessel. The priest would take the thick, fragrant oil in his warm hands and rub it slowly and deeply into the black granite surface of the statue. The heavy, intoxicating scent of the crushed resin and the warm oil completely filled the small, claustrophobic chamber and trapped the men in a thick cloud of holy perfume. The application of the oil followed specific anatomical guidelines that recognized the stone statue as a truly living, breathing divine body. The slow dressing ceremony that concluded the morning purification involved incredibly fine garments that had been woven specifically for divine use. The linen was spun by dedicated priestesses who had undergone strict purification procedures before ever touching the sacred flax. The soft white cloth was carefully draped and folded around the oiled stone shoulders of the statue. The placement of every single fold and every single knot was absolutely critical. Any slight asymmetry or accidental disorder in the appearance of the god could indicate terrible divine displeasure and bring ruin upon the entire temple. Heavy golden collars, studded with lapis lazuli and deep red carnelian, were placed gently around the neck of the stone figure. Finally, the presentation of the morning meal marked the transition from purification to actual sustenance. The gods needed physical nourishment to maintain their heavy presence in the mortal world. The priests brought forward freshly baked white bread shaped into perfect sacred spirals and triangles. They brought large clay jugs of weak sweet beer, brewed specifically in the temple kitchens from sacred malted barley. They presented freshly roasted cuts of rich beef and duck carefully slaughtered under strict religious protocols. The hot, savory smell of the roasted meat mixed heavily with the thick, sweet smoke of the burning frankincense. The high priest would hold each offering item before the staring crystal eyes of the statue and recite the specific dedicatory formula. He would then place the warm food carefully on the low stone altar in the prescribed geometric position. The god was fully awake now. The stone was warm and oiled and dressed in bright gold. The heavy, dark forces of chaos had been successfully pushed back into the shadows, and the fragile cosmic order of the universe had been perfectly restored for one more day. The immense, quiet dedication of these men holding the universe together with oil and water and whispered words is truly profound to consider. They carried the ultimate heavy burden of existence, so that the rest of the world could simply wake up and breathe the morning air in peace. You can let go of your own daily burdens right now as you rest quietly in the dark. You do not need to hold the heavy sky up tonight. The massive stone walls of the ancient temples are standing strong, and the dark waters are safely contained. The deep, heavy scent of the burning frankincense is slowly fading away into the cool night air. The small, flickering flame of the oil lamp has been gently blown out, leaving you in the perfect, safe darkness. Let the slow, steady rhythm of your own deep breathing guide you downward into the calm, still waters of a long and truly peaceful sleep. The daily maintenance of the gods inside the warm stone temples was incredibly vital for the waking world. But mortal human flesh is ultimately frail and temporary. Eventually, every single human breath must come to a slow end, and the heavy, quiet silence of death must enter the room. In the ancient Egyptian mind, death was absolutely not a sudden, violent ending of existence. It was merely the very beginning of an incredibly long and deeply grueling physical transformation. When the final breath left a human body, an entirely different category of dark, sacred ceremonies immediately began in the shadows. These specific rituals were so incredibly complex and so profoundly transformative that they required exactly 70 long days to fully complete. They involved the literal physical reconstruction of the dead human body into a perfect divine vessel, capable of navigating the treacherous, freezing dark of the endless underworld. The ancient priests did not simply preserve the dead flesh to prevent natural decay. They enacted a heavy, sacred drama that slowly transformed the dead person into a mirror image of the great god Osiris himself. You must understand the profound, heavy myth of Osiris to truly grasp the terrifying scale of this physical transformation. Osiris was the benevolent first king of the ancient world. His jealous brother Set murdered him through cruel deception and violently dismembered his body into 14 bloody pieces. Set scattered these broken pieces across the vast, endless length of the great river. The devoted mourning wife Isis searched tirelessly through the muddy green reeds and the dark, deep waters to find the scattered remains of her beloved husband. She gathered the broken pieces and reassembled them perfectly on the wet riverbank. Through deep, powerful magic, she temporarily restored life to his reconstructed body before he finally descended into the deep earth to rule the dark underworld as the ultimate silent judge of the dead. This specific ancient mythological tragedy provided the exact absolute template for every single funeral ritual performed in the dry desert. The 70-day preservation process directly paralleled the exact amount of time the great god spent in his broken, dismembered state before his magical resurrection. The exhausted embalmers who performed these intimate, gruesome procedures truly understood themselves as elite ritual specialists, completely recreating divine ancient magic. Their dark, dusty workshops functioned as incredibly sacred spaces, where ordinary human corpses underwent the exact same transformative processes that had originally elevated the great god to his throne in the dark. The initial physical phase of the mummification began just a few short hours after the final breath was taken in the home. Specialized priests approached the cold, silent body, resting on a slanted stone washing table. They held incredibly sharp, dark knives, carved entirely from pure black obsidian volcanic glass. The obsidian blades had been heavily consecrated through specific whispered ceremonies in the pitch black of the night. The priest made the very first careful, deep incision into the left side of the cold abdomen. This specific sharp cutting physically represented the original terrible bloody wound inflicted by the chaotic brother Set. The priests performed their grim, bloody work while constantly reciting low, rhythmic incantations that invoked the incredibly protective presence of the mourning goddess Isis. The location of the deep cut followed precise, ancient anatomical guidelines derived directly from the sacred religious texts. It was perfectly positioned to allow the careful extraction of the internal organs while minimizing any visible damage to the overall physical integrity of the human form. The slow, careful removal of the soft internal organs required extraordinary physical skill and deep religious knowledge. Each wet, heavy organ possessed a very specific theological significance and required its own individual ritual treatment in the dim light of the workshop. The dark liver and the soft lungs and the heavy stomach and the long coiled intestines were slowly extracted through the small abdominal incision using specialized, long bronze instruments. The soft, delicate brain was carefully removed through the nasal cavity using long, thin metal probes with small hooked ends. The priests worked in total absolute silence, except for the soft, wet physical sounds of the delicate extraction process. But the heavy human heart remained perfectly untouched and completely undisturbed within the dark, empty cavity of the chest. The ancient theology identified the physical beating heart as the absolute, literal seat of human consciousness and pure moral judgment. It was the single organ that contained the entire heavy record of a human life. It was the exact organ that would eventually be weighed against the pure white feather in the dark, terrifying underworld. It had to remain perfectly safe inside the hollow body. Each extracted wet organ underwent its own, separate, careful mummification process on small stone tables. They were placed gently within 4 specific carved containers known as canopic jars. These heavy stone jars represented the eternal protective embrace of 4 specific powerful deities. The heavy lids of the stone jars were beautifully carved into the likenesses of the 4 protective sons of Horus. The human-headed god protected the dark liver from corruption. The baboon-headed god guarded the soft lungs. The jackal-headed god watched constantly over the stomach. The falcon-headed god protected the coiled intestines from the dark magic of the void. The careful placement of the soft organs within these heavy stone jars required incredibly precise ritual timing. Each heavy stone lid was sealed tight with hot melting wax, while the priests recited protective formulas that permanently bound the spiritual essence of the dead person to their removed physical remains. The hot wax cooled slowly and hardened into a perfect, unbreakable, eternal seal. The dehydration process that immediately followed the organ removal represented the absolute most crucial and longest phase of the entire mummification ritual. It prevented the natural decay of the flesh while symbolically purifying the empty body for its final divine transformation. The hollow corpse was completely covered and buried deep inside a massive pile of gray natron salt. Natron is a naturally occurring harsh chemical mixture harvested directly from dry desert-like beds. It possesses a sharp, biting chemical smell that aggressively draws all the moisture completely out of the surrounding air. The heavy granular salt completely absorbed the bodily fluids and created a highly alkaline, harsh environment that was totally hostile to any natural bacterial growth. This slow chemical drying process required exactly 40 long days to complete. During this incredible stretch of time, the body remained completely undisturbed, buried deep within the heavy gray salt bed. The priests performed daily purification ceremonies around the perimeter of the silent, dark workshop. The harsh, biting smell of the drying salt mixed heavily with the sweet, thick smoke of the burning frankincense. The natron salt itself held profound religious significance. The ancient theology deeply associated this specific dry mineral with ultimate divine purification. They believed that the exact same harsh substance used to cleanse the stone temple floors could literally transform ordinary human flesh into a pure, perfect material suitable for divine spiritual inhabitation. The senior priest responsible for constantly monitoring the slow dehydration process would carefully test the effectiveness of the salt by examining its slight color changes and its sharp crystalline formation. He used these tiny physical indicators to determine exactly when the buried body had achieved the perfect state of absolute ritual purity. The body was slowly turning from soft, decaying human flesh into hard, permanent divine stone. While the silent body rested deep in the salt for 40 days, other dedicated ritual specialists prepared the massive amounts of materials needed for the final wrapping ceremony. The long, thin linen bandages used for the mummification were absolutely not ordinary pieces of woven cloth. They were specially produced fabric that had been woven under strict ritual conditions and heavily consecrated through elaborate long ceremonies. The green flax used to make these soft bandages was grown exclusively in the sacred temple fields under the watchful eyes of the priests. It was harvested entirely by hand during specific, auspicious lunar phases. Every single step of the slow textile production process was accompanied by soft, protective incantations and heavy water purification rituals. The physical wrapping procedure finally began on the 41st day and continued relentlessly for nearly 3 full weeks. Each individual thin layer of the soft linen strips was applied tightly to the dry skin according to precise ancient religious protocols. The embalmer started by carefully wrapping every single individual stiff, dry finger and every single dry toe. He treated each tiny digit as a completely separate, sacred ritual object, requiring its own whispered protective formula. The dry arms and the stiff, heavy legs received multiple tight layers of the soft linen strips. The rough, tight binding of the cloth over the dried skin created a soft, rhythmic scratching sound in the quiet workshop room. The priests carefully placed specific, heavy magical amulets between the tight layers of linen at predetermined anatomical positions. These specific positions corresponded perfectly to the divine protection points described in the ancient funerary texts. The placement of these heavy gold and carved stone amulets followed a very complex theological system that completely transformed the dead body into a sacred magical object capable of channeling raw divine power in the dark afterlife. A massive heavy heart scarab, beautifully carved from deep green stone, was positioned directly over the empty chest cavity, right above the resting human heart. The cold, heavy weight of the smooth green stone, pressing down against the dry, dead chest, ensured a favorable, quiet judgment in the dark underworld. The golden pillar amulet, representing the unbreakable backbone of Osiris, was placed carefully on the lower torso to provide permanent structural stability for the resurrected body. The red stone knot, symbolizing the protective blood of Isis, was positioned tightly near the wrapped neck to constantly invoke the powerful magic of the mourning goddess. Each individual amulet required its own personal consecration through specific chanted incantations that actively awakened its deep protective properties. The embalmer would hold each cold, heavy piece of carved stone and pure gold in his warm hands, while reciting the appropriate ancient formula. His chanted words permanently bound the raw power of the amulet directly to the spiritual essence of the dead person. The most powerful amulets were crafted entirely from pure, solid gold. The ancient Egyptians deeply associated this heavy yellow metal with the actual literal flesh of the immortal gods. Their precise placement within the tight linen wrappings followed strict geometric patterns that created completely invisible protective energy fields entirely around the vital centers of the resting body. The long, slow process of wrapping the body required an immense amount of absolute physical patience from the dedicated priests. They had to maintain the exact precise tension on the thin linen strips as they pulled them tightly across the dry, hollowed contours of the dead flesh. If the cloth was pulled too tight, it might tear the fragile, preserved skin and ruin the perfect physical symmetry of the divine vessel. If the cloth was wrapped too loosely, the heavy magical amulets would easily slip out of their proper sacred alignments, and the protective energy fields would completely fail in the terrifying dark underworld. The priests moved in a slow, hypnotic circular dance around the silent resting body. The soft sound of the long linen bandages unspooling from their wooden rolls sounded exactly like the quiet, rhythmic breathing of a deeply sleeping giant. They poured hot melted tree resin heavily over the tight linen layers to permanently glue the fabric completely together. The hot, sticky resin smelled strongly of deep pine forests and ancient crushed amber. It filled the small stone workshop with a thick, heavy, fragrant smoke that made the eyes of the priests water continuously. The dark resin cooled very slowly and hardened into a thick, impenetrable shell that turned the entire wrapped body into a single, solid, heavy piece of beautiful sacred art. The physical weight of the finished mummy was incredibly immense. It was no longer just a simple, dead human being. It was a heavy, dense monument of pure, concentrated magic and hardened organic material ready to face eternity. The heavy golden mask resting perfectly over the wrapped face caught the dim, flickering light of the small oil lamps and reflected a completely calm and entirely eternal expression back into the dark room. The wide, painted eyes on the heavy gold mask stared blankly forward into the infinite, terrifying distance of the cosmos. They were completely unbothered by the passing of normal human time or the petty minor struggles of the living world outside the thick workshop walls. The 70 days of brutal physical extraction and harsh chemical burning and tight, suffocating binding had finally achieved their ultimate quiet purpose. The total absolute silence of the preserved body was deeply profound and incredibly beautiful. It was the exact, deep silence of a massive, ancient stone, resting quietly at the very bottom of a cold, dark ocean. You can slowly adopt that exact same profound, absolute silence in your own tired, resting body tonight. You can allow your heavy arms and your tired legs to become perfectly still and entirely unmoving on the soft mattress. Let the deep, soothing quiet of the dark room wrap completely around your exhausted shoulders, just like those soft, ancient linen bandages. You are perfectly insulated from all the loud, chaotic noise and the frantic, rushing stress of the outside waking world. The heavy golden mask of deep sleep is slowly settling perfectly over your own tired face. It completely hides all of your lingering daily worries, and it perfectly smooths away all the anxious, tight lines on your soft forehead. You are completely safe and perfectly preserved in this quiet, heavy moment of absolute, peaceful transition. You do not need to move or speak or think about the daylight. You are completely held by the comforting dark and perfectly ready to slowly drift down into the deepest parts of the quiet sleeping world. The long, grueling physical preservation of the dead body was finally complete, but the newly wrapped vessel was still completely trapped in a deep, terrifying silence. The mummified body was perfectly pure and heavily protected by the golden amulets, but it was essentially entirely paralyzed in the dark. It could not see the long, dark path ahead, and it could not speak the sacred passwords required to open the massive, heavy gates of the underworld. The connection between the preserved physical body and the wandering spiritual essence had been violently severed by the sharp, sudden shock of mortal death. To completely restore this vital cosmic connection, the priests had to perform one of the most incredibly complex and deeply terrifying ceremonies in all of ancient religion. This was the sacred ritual known as the opening of the mouth. It was a long, elaborate process that required the intense physical participation of multiple high priests, and it could easily extend over several long, exhausting days of continuous loud chanting. The ceremony aimed to forcefully and magically restore every single lost sensory capability and all the basic bodily functions to the dead person. It would allow the frozen mummy to breathe and eat and drink and speak in the dark, dangerous afterlife. The profound theological foundation of this specific ritual rested on the absolute belief that proper ceremonial intervention could literally force the cold, dead flesh to remember how to be perfectly alive. The long ceremony began with the heavy, stiff mummy being carried carefully out into the open air of the temple courtyard. The priests placed the wrapped body completely upright against a specially constructed heavy wooden support frame. They carefully positioned the body so that the blank, staring golden face mask looked directly east toward the distant horizon. This exact physical positioning was absolutely crucial for the success of the dangerous magic. The overall effectiveness of the entire ritual depended entirely upon the dead face receiving the very first warm life, giving rays of the rising morning sun. The primary officiant of the complex ceremony was typically the eldest living son of the deceased person, or a very high-ranking temple priest dressed in the spotted skin of a wild leopard. He approached the silent, upright mummy while carefully carrying a heavy wooden box filled with a set of highly specialized, strange ritual tools. These specific tools had been heavily consecrated and deeply blessed for this exact, specific, terrifying purpose. The absolute most important and most dangerous of these tools was the Pesesh Kef knife. It was a very strange and deeply ancient blade, carved entirely from a single piece of dark, sharp flint. It had a highly distinctive forked fishtail shape at the very tip of the stone. This ancient shape was specifically designed to symbolically cut open the stiff, bound mouth of the mummy and violently restore the lost physical power of human speech. The priest stepped very close to the wrapped face and slowly raised the cold, sharp flint blade in his trembling hand. The priest would gently press the cold, sharp edge of the stone blade directly against the painted golden lips of the mummy mask. While maintaining this firm physical contact, he would loudly recite complex, heavy incantations that perfectly invoked the exact same divine words originally used by the gods to restore life to the broken body of Osiris. The direct physical contact between the ancient stone blade and the dry linen wrappings created a powerful, invisible ritual circuit. This circuit successfully channeled raw, intense, divine energy directly into the reconstructed, frozen form of the dead person. The priest then took up a set of 4 small, cold iron knives. These were called the Nechery blades, and they perfectly represented the 4 vast cardinal directions of the compass. The priest used these cold, heavy iron blades to magically restore the ability of the dead person to physically move and successfully navigate the dark, confusing paths of the terrifying afterlife. He touched each cold iron blade to different specific points on the wrapped body while loudly reciting the long directional formulas. These heavy chanted words perfectly oriented the lost wandering soul within the confusing cosmic geography they would soon encounter in the deep underworld. The dark metallic composition of these specific blades held a very special and deep significance to the ancient people. They deeply associated the cold, unyielding iron with the indestructible bones of the chaotic god Set. They truly believed that the touch of the iron provided absolute perfect protection against the massive, creeping, malevolent forces that waited in the dark. The long ceremony also included the very strange use of a simple wooden adze of a carpenter. This specific curved tool was used to symbolically pry open the painted eyes of the deceased and completely restore their lost physical vision. The priest would hold the curved wooden implement very close to the golden head of the mummy while performing slow, sweeping gestures that perfectly mimicked the physical opening of heavy, tired eyelids. His slow, hypnotic movements were completely synchronized with heavy, loud incantations that invoked the incredibly protective and all-seeing gaze of the great falcon god Horus. The sharp, curved blade of the wooden adze perfectly represented the thin, glowing crescent moon in the night sky. This shape connected the dead person directly to the eternal lunar cycles that strictly governed all physical regeneration and cosmic renewal in the ancient universe. The priest then performed a truly visceral and deeply startling act of sympathetic magic. He took the freshly severed bloody leg of a massive sacrificed bull and forcefully pressed the raw, heavy meat directly against the wrapped chest of the mummy. This heavy, bleeding leg embodied the pure, raw, massive physical life force of the strongest animal in the entire world. The priest loudly recited heavy, thick formulas that magically transferred the immense raw physical strength and the endless endurance of the massive bull directly into the spiritual body of the dead person. The long, exhausting ceremony slowly reached its massive, loud climax with the final presentation of the actual food offerings. The priests brought forward large clay plates, piled high with freshly baked soft bread and cold sweet beer and roasted rich meat. The priest would hold each individual piece of food very close to the painted mouth of the mummy while reciting the final heavy incantations. These formulas magically enabled the spiritual consumption of the physical food in the world beyond. They created a permanent, unbreakable, magical connection between the warm, fresh food and the newly transformed invisible digestive system of the dead person. The priest shouted the final absolute commands into the cold morning air. You shall speak with your mouth. You shall walk with your legs. You shall work with your arms. You shall see with your eyes. The long, terrifying process was finally completely finished. The dead person was now fully equipped and completely ready to face the absolute most terrifying moment of their entire long existence. The newly restored soul had to descend completely alone into the pitch-black depths of the deep underworld. They had to walk slowly and fearfully into the massive, terrifying golden space known as the Hall of Two Truths. This was the ultimate terrifying courtroom of the entire cosmos. It was the place where absolute total cosmic justice was strictly administered according to the harsh, immutable laws of the universe. The massive, towering walls of the Great Hall gleamed blindingly like polished solid gold, and the smooth, cold floors were made entirely from deep blue lapis lazuli stone. The blue floor perfectly represented the dark, infinite primordial waters of the very first creation. Sitting in absolute terrifying silence along the entire dark perimeter of the massive hall were 42 towering divine judges. Each terrifying god represented a different specific region of the mortal world and a different specific aspect of strict moral law. Their unblinking, glowing eyes watched the tiny, trembling human soul enter the massive open space. Waiting patiently in the very absolute center of the great golden room was Anubis. He was the terrifying, tall, jackal-headed god of deep mummification and the ultimate dark guardian of the dead. He did not speak a single word to the terrified entering soul. He simply stood quietly beside a massive, towering set of perfectly balanced golden scales. These specific heavy scales were crafted from impossible cosmic materials that transcended all normal physical properties. They possessed the terrifying absolute ability to actually weigh the invisible moral substance of a human life. Standing quietly beside the massive scales was Thoth the Ibis, headed god of ancient wisdom and infinite writing. He held a long, sharp reed pen and a flat, smooth writing palette in his long, strange hands. He was there to perfectly record the absolute final outcome of the terrifying judgment. His written words carried the exact same heavy creative power that had originally spoken the entire universe into sudden existence. The tiny, trembling soul of the dead person stepped slowly up to the massive golden scales. The heavy physical heart that had been carefully left completely undisturbed inside their mummified chest was suddenly and magically removed. The beating red muscle was placed very gently and incredibly carefully onto the cold golden pan of the left scale. The small, heavy piece of human meat contained the absolute, complete, total record of every single tiny action and every single fleeting thought and every single hidden dark intention the person had ever experienced in their entire mortal life. It was the ultimate, infallible, bloody witness to their true, hidden moral character. On the exact opposite right side of the massive golden scales, Anubis placed a single pure white feather. It was the delicate, soft feather of Maat, representing the absolute, perfect, flawless balance of pure cosmic truth and unyielding universal justice. The absolute, terrifying silence of the great golden hall was so incredibly profound that the dead soul could clearly hear the frantic, wet thumping of their own removed heart resting on the cold golden metal of the scale. The massive jackal god Anubis moved with an incredibly slow and completely deliberate, terrifying grace. His long, dark fingers gently adjusted the heavy golden chains holding the two flat balance pans. The soft white feather glowed with a faint, pure, internal light that stood in stark, sharp contrast to the wet, dark red muscle of the human heart. The dead person stood completely frozen in absolute pure terror. The cold sweat dripped slowly down their transparent spiritual back as they watched the heavy golden beam of the massive scale begin to slowly tip and sway in the dead still air. The tiny, microscopic creaking sound of the ancient golden metal rubbing against itself echoed loudly and terrifyingly across the vast, empty lapis lazuli floor. It was the absolute loudest and most terrifying sound in the entire history of the universe. It was the exact sound of ultimate final destiny being decided in real time. The hot, foul-smelling breath of the waiting crocodile demon Ammit drifted slowly across the cold blue floor and wrapped around the trembling bare ankles of the judged soul. The thick, heavy drool from her massive, jagged teeth hissed and smoked quietly as it hit the smooth, polished stones. The waiting tension was a physical, crushing weight that threatened to completely shatter the fragile, transparent mind of the dead person before the scale even finished moving. This single, soft white feather possessed absolutely no physical weight in the normal, conventional sense, but it carried the entire massive, crushing authority of absolute divine law. It was the ultimate terrifying standard against which all human behavior was permanently measured. The sheer incredible lightness of the soft feather symbolize the absolute ease with which a truly righteous and pure soul could perfectly align with the heavy cosmic principles of the universe. The massive golden scales creaked very softly and groaned quietly in the dead silence of the hall, as the two completely opposite weights were perfectly balanced against each other. As the tall jackal god watched the shifting, moving scales, the terrified dead person was strictly required to loudly recite the negative confession. This was a long, detailed, desperate declaration of total absolute innocence, directed specifically at each of the 42 terrifying silent judges sitting in the dark shadows. The desperate soul had to speak with absolute perfect pronunciation and completely total unwavering conviction. I have not committed any sin against people. I have not ever mistreated the cattle. I have not told a single lie in the place of absolute truth. Each desperate shouted statement addressed a very specific and completely different category of earthly wrongdoing. It created a massive, comprehensive inventory of absolute ethical behavior. The 42 towering deities listened to every single trembling word with their terrifying supernatural attention. Their omniscient divine perception was completely capable of instantly detecting even the tiniest microscopic falsehood or hidden moral compromise in the desperate, shaking voice of the dead person. They knew every single dark secret because they had silently observed every single action the person had ever taken in their entire mortal life. If the heavy red heart proved to be even a tiny fraction of an ounce heavier than the soft white feather, the ultimate terrible punishment was absolutely instantaneous and totally permanent. She was known simply as the devourer of the dead. If the heavy heart sank downward on the golden scale, the monster Ammit would instantly lunge forward from the dark shadows and completely devour the beating red muscle in a single violent, terrifying bite. This was not merely a simple death. It was the absolute, total, complete erasure of the entire soul from all of existence forever. It eliminated any tiny possibility of future resurrection or continuing afterlife. It was the true, final, absolute dark void. But if the human heart was pure and light, it would balance perfectly equally against the soft white feather. The tall jackal god would nod his dark head in absolute silence. The ibis-headed god would smoothly write the perfect, joyful result onto his flat palate. The terrified soul would instantly feel a massive, overwhelming wave of pure, total relief and absolute profound peace wash completely over their exhausted spiritual body. They had successfully passed the ultimate final test of the dark universe. They were immediately transformed into an eternal shining spirit, capable of moving entirely freely between the bright, warm world of the living and the quiet, peaceful realm of the dead. You can feel that exact same massive, profound sense of total ultimate relief settling gently over your own tired mind, right now, in the dark. The heavy, terrifying judgment of the long, busy day is completely, utterly over. You do not need to desperately justify any of your small actions or defend any of your fleeting, tired thoughts to the quiet, empty room. Your own heavy beating heart is completely safe and perfectly balanced in the soft, quiet dark. There are absolutely no terrifying monsters waiting for you in the deep shadows of your own quiet bedroom. The heavy golden scales of your own active mind have finally stopped swinging back and forth. They have found their absolute, perfect, quiet balance for the night. Let the soft, pure lightness of the white feather completely fill your tired chest. You are entirely, totally, completely innocent of any burden tonight. Let the heavy, crushing weight of the demanding world fall completely away from your relaxed shoulders. You are perfectly free to simply walk slowly away from the loud noises and enter the endless, quiet fields of your own deep, peaceful dreams. Let the absolute profound stillness of the ancient eternal night hold you perfectly safe and totally secure as you drift slowly and beautifully down into the deep, comforting dark. We have spent a long time in the deep, quiet shadows of the terrifying underworld, where the heavy hearts of the dead are carefully weighed in the dark. But the ancient universe was a place of endless turning cycles, and the deep dark of the night always eventually yields to the blinding heat of the desert sun. We must rise back up from the cold, silent halls of judgment and return to the bright, warm world of the living, breathing people. While the dead navigated the terrifying paths of the underworld, the living population of Egypt gathered in massive, loud crowds to participate in the grand theatrical maintenance of the physical cosmos. The quiet, intimate, daily care of the stone gods inside the dark sanctuaries was incredibly vital, but it was only the quiet foundation of their vast religious practice. Beyond those heavy, closed wooden doors lay a massive, complex calendar of grand public festivals that completely transformed entire ancient cities into massive open-air stages for pure cosmic drama. These spectacular events drew thousands upon thousands of ordinary working people into elaborate, deep celebrations that violently renewed the fragile bonds between the high heavens and the hard earth. The absolute most magnificent and truly overwhelming of all these massive public celebrations was the Grand Opet Festival. It was an incredibly long 19-day spectacle that completely transformed the great city of Thebes into the absolute pulsing cosmic center of the entire human civilization. This specific massive festival celebrated the highly sacred and deeply secretive divine marriage between the great creator god Amun-Ra and his powerful female consort Maat. This divine cosmic union was absolutely necessary to magically renew the fragile political legitimacy of the mortal pharaoh and to forcefully reinforce the strict cosmic order that physically sustained the entire Egyptian society. The absolute central core ritual of this massive, loud festival involved physically transporting the heavy, sacred statues of the great gods from their dark, permanent residence at the massive Karnak temple all the way down the river to the southern stone sanctuary of the Luxor temple. This long, slow physical journey through the crowded, dusty streets and down the wide, flowing river was not just a simple parade. It symbolically and literally reenacted the very first primordial act of the original world creation. The intense, frantic preparation for this massive event began many long, hot months in advance. The dark temple workshops were completely filled with the loud, rhythmic sounds of skilled craftsmen working diligently under the strict, watchful eyes of the senior priests. They created incredibly elaborate, colorful decorations and heavy, beautiful ceremonial objects that would loudly proclaim the powerful presence of the gods during their long public journey. They polished the massive wooden ceremonial boats, known as the sacred barks, until the thick layers of pure gold leaf covering the wood shone with a blinding mirror brightness in the hot sun. The central cabin shrines, resting on the decks of the wooden boats, were carefully fitted with brand new sheer linen curtains that would effectively shield the sacred stone statues from the impure gazing eyes of the common public. The largest of these magnificent golden barks measured over 60 long feet from the curving bow to the high stern. It was an absolute masterpiece of ancient religious craftsmanship, featuring a central dark shrine flanked by massive protective statues of crouching sphinxes. The eyes of the sphinxes were beautifully inlaid with deep blue lapis lazuli stone and pure shining gold. The opening ceremony of the massive festival commenced exactly at the very first light of dawn on the strictly appointed day. The high priest performed the usual daily awakening ritual in the dark sanctuary, but he did so with unprecedented long elaboration. The heavy dark stone statue of the god was carefully dressed in specific festive regalia that included an incredibly heavy towering crown made of pure solid gold and large precious stones. The massive golden bark was heavily loaded with fresh, sweet offerings that would magically sustain the tired deity during the extended loud celebration. The incredibly heavy golden boat was carefully lifted up and placed directly onto the bare, waiting shoulders of specially trained temple priests. These specific bearers wore perfectly pure white linen garments, and they had completely shaved their entire heads to loudly proclaim their absolute strict ritual purity. These dedicated men had undergone many long, difficult months of intense physical conditioning just to develop the massive raw strength and the perfect physical coordination required to safely transport the unimaginably heavy golden boat through the dense, chaotic crowds. You can try to imagine the sheer, immense, crushing physical weight of that massive golden vessel pressing heavily down onto the bare, smooth skin of their straining shoulders. The thick wooden carrying poles dug deeply into their burning muscles with every single slow step they took. But they did not falter or stumble under the crushing divine burden. Their slow, deliberate marching movements were so incredibly perfectly synchronized that they created the breathtaking magical illusion that the massive, heavy golden vessel was actually floating effortlessly through the hot, dusty air, entirely on its own. The massive crowds of ordinary people that gathered tightly along the entire long processional route represented every single diverse level of the ancient society. There were wealthy, soft nobles who had traveled for many weeks from the distant green provinces, standing right next to the poor, rough farmers who had temporarily abandoned their muddy fields just to witness the rare, terrifying passage of the divine beings. The ecstatic, cheering spectators threw thousands of soft, bright flower petals directly into the dusty air and scattered handfuls of sweet, burning incense along the entire path of the golden bark. The incredibly dense, aromatic clouds of the sweet smoke completely filled the hot street and masked the sharp smell of the sweating bodies pressing closely together in the heat. The people truly believed that the thick, sweet smoke would deeply please the passing gods and encourage them to maintain their powerful protective presence among the fragile human population. Professional, highly skilled musicians were positioned carefully at regular intervals along the entire long processional route. They played loud, rhythmic, sacred melodies on large wooden harps and thin reed flutes and heavy, tight animal skin drums. The deep, booming, rhythmic, physical pulse of the heavy drums was specifically designed to help the straining priests perfectly maintain their slow, agonizing marching pace, while simultaneously invoking the deep blessings of the passing deities. The precise moment when the heavy golden barks finally entered the cool, dark courtyards of the Luxor temple marked a profound, sudden transformation in the overall atmosphere of the long festival. The loud, chaotic public spectacle instantly dissolved into an incredibly tense and deeply intimate divine encounter. The massive temple courtyards were normally strictly accessible only to the pure priests and the high royal officials, but today they were opened to a very small selected group of the ordinary public who had previously undergone very strict, intense purification procedures. These highly privileged, quiet witnesses observed in total, absolute silence as the heavy divine statues were very carefully transferred from the dark cabins of their traveling golden barks into the deep, permanent stone shrines of the temple. This delicate transfer required absolute perfect physical coordination between multiple sweating teams of dedicated priests. The sacred marriage ritual that formed the absolute theological core of the entire massive festival took place deeply hidden within the most completely sacred and entirely restricted inner dark chamber of the Luxor temple. The cold, heavy statues of the great god and the great goddess were carefully positioned facing each other to symbolically and literally consummate their profound divine cosmic union. This incredibly sacred ceremony remained completely hidden from the curious eyes of the public, but its successful completion was loudly announced to the waiting city through massive blasting trumpet fanfares and the sudden coordinated release of incredibly thick, dense clouds of sweet incense that rose high above the tall stone temple walls. The exhausted priests who actively participated in this hidden ritual truly understood that they were facilitating an actual physical cosmic event that fundamentally renewed the raw creative forces governing the entire ancient civilization. The mortal pharaoh played an absolutely essential and incredibly demanding physical role in this massive festival. His personal physical presence was considered completely necessary for the magical effectiveness of the entire ritual. The divine cosmic marriage between the high gods was deeply believed to forcefully renew the personal divine legitimacy of the human king. The concept of the ancient Egyptian king was not simply a matter of standard political human authority. The ancient theology demanded a truly terrifying and incredibly profound physical transformation of the human ruler. The coronation ceremonies that originally elevated a simple mortal breathing prince into the absolute position of divine living kingship constituted the most complex and deeply secretive rituals in all of ancient religion. They involved dark procedures so incredibly sacred that their complete full details were known only to the absolute highest-ranking senior priests. The foundational belief was that the human king did not simply rule by a distant divine mandate. He literally, physically became a living, breathing god walking on the earth. His soft, fragile human body served as the literal, earthly containing vessel for the massive cosmic forces that constantly maintained the universal order. This terrifying, ultimate transformation required long, painful ritual procedures that literally, physically reconstructed the spiritual essence of the human prince. The brutal preparation for this total transformation began many long, difficult years before the actual heavy crown was ever placed upon his head. The designated royal heir underwent intense, grueling training in the secret ritual knowledge and the harsh spiritual disciplines entirely necessary for holding the crushing weight of divine kingship. But the most intense phase of the physical preparation occurred just before the coronation. It involved strict, agonizing dietary restrictions and deeply uncomfortable physical purification procedures that very gradually altered the actual biological composition of the body of the prince. The ancient priests needed to make his mortal human flesh perfectly suitable for the terrifying inhabitation of a divine cosmic consciousness. These harsh physical preparations began with a brutal 40-day period of complete ritual fasting. The prince was forced to eliminate all the accumulated invisible impurities of his ordinary mortal existence. He was kept isolated in a quiet, dark stone room and fed only the most heavily restricted and purely blessed diet. He consumed only small pieces of perfectly pure white bread baked from special grain grown exclusively in the hidden temple fields. He drank only the warm, fresh milk taken from specific white cows that had been permanently dedicated to the great goddess of the sky. He tasted only raw, sweet honey that had been carefully collected from the buzzing hives during very specific, highly auspicious lunar phases in the dark of the night. He felt the deep, constant, gnawing physical ache of true hunger in his shrinking stomach for 40 long days and 40 long nights. The slow, creeping hunger entirely stripped away his normal human desires and left his mind completely, incredibly clear and totally empty. like a deep, quiet pool of perfectly still water. His physical body underwent a slow, systematic external purification through incredibly elaborate daily bathing rituals. He bathed, shivering in cold consecrated water drawn from the deep, dark, sacred wells. He was rubbed aggressively with rough stones that had been heated in the sacred temple fires. The absolute most crucial and physically intimate stage of his long preparation was the total, complete removal of every single tiny hair on his entire human body. The ancient theology deeply associated the growth of natural body hair with the wild, chaotic animal nature of the dirty mortal world. To become a pure living god, the prince had to be completely and totally smooth, like a polished piece of heavy marble stone. The long, slow shaving process was performed entirely by the senior priests, using incredibly sharp, delicate razors, forged from pure, solid gold. The heavy gold metal had been consecrated through long, elaborate, whispered ceremonies in the dark. The priests moved the sharp, cold golden blades very slowly and incredibly carefully over the soft skin of the young prince. Their slow, deliberate movements followed strictly prescribed ancient patterns that symbolically and literally stripped away every single remaining trace of his previous mortal human identity. This highly uncomfortable and deeply exposing procedure was repeated every single day throughout the entire long preparation period. The actual coronation ceremony finally began during the freezing pre-dawn hours of a specific day, carefully calculated by the exhausted temple astronomers. The timing required absolute precise mathematical coordination. The ceremony could only proceed forward when very specific bright constellations appeared at exact, predetermined positions relative to the dark horizon. The ritual space was a deeply hidden sacred chamber, located in the very center of the massive temple complex. The silent prince walked slowly into the cold, dark room, wearing only a simple sheer garment of pure white linen. The physical cold of the stone floor seeped deeply into his bare, smooth feet. The most terrifying part of the entire long ceremony was the receiving of the 5 secret royal names. These names were not simply arbitrary political titles used for grand public proclamations. They were highly concentrated magical formulas that literally forcefully activated the different specific aspects of his new divine kingship. The exact proper pronunciation of these hidden words literally violently called into existence the massive spiritual forces that would govern his entire long reign. The first and absolute most fundamental name was the Horus name. It firmly established the identity of the king as the literal, physical, earthly manifestation of the great predatory falcon god of the bright sky. This specific secret name was revealed through a deeply strange and terrifying animal divination ceremony. A massive live wild falcon that had been violently captured from the high desert cliffs and heavily consecrated through dark rituals was brought directly into the small enclosed stone chamber. The terrified wild bird was suddenly released into the dark enclosed air of the room. The massive feathered wings beat frantically and loudly against the cold, stale air. The sharp, dark eyes of the predatory bird scanned the shadows of the room. The priests watched the frantic flight of the wild bird with absolute, total, silent concentration. The exact specific direction of its flight and the precise exact location where the sharp talons finally landed determined the specific hidden elements of the sacred name. The prince stood completely, perfectly still, like a frozen marble statue, while the massive wild bird flew aggressively around his bare, smooth head. He did not flinch or blink when the sharp, rushing wind from the heavy beating wings brushed against his pale face. He simply waited in the total quiet darkness to receive the terrifying, heavy burden of his new, eternal identity. He was no longer just a simple, breathing human man. He was the absolute center of the entire spinning universe. He was the living, breathing, physical anchor that held the heavy, dark sky completely separated from the soft, fragile earth. The intense, profound weight of that total, absolute responsibility is completely crushing to the normal, tired mind. But you do not need to carry any of that massive, heavy weight tonight. You do not need to hold the fragile sky up with your own tired arms, or maintain the complex order of the vast, complicated universe. You are completely, totally free to just lay your heavy head down onto the soft, cool pillow. The massive golden boats have completely finished their long, exhausting journey, and they are resting safely in the quiet, dark harbor. The loud, chanting priests have finally stopped their singing, and the grand temples are completely, totally silent. Let the immense, profound quiet of the deep, ancient night completely fill your own resting mind as you sink slowly down into a heavy, perfect sleep. The grand pharaoh, sitting high upon his golden throne, carried the massive, crushing weight of the entire universe on his broad, smooth shoulders. He was the living, breathing God who protected the vast borders of the kingdom from the creeping, absolute chaos of the endless void. But the ordinary, simple people, living far away from the massive stone temples and the shining golden palaces, faced a completely different kind of terrifying daily darkness. When the hot, bright sun finally sank below the western desert hills, and the deep, heavy shadows stretched long across the muddy riverbanks, a very profound and very intimate fear settled over the small, fragile homes of the working families. They did not worry about the grand cosmic balance of the distant stars or the complex shifting politics of the high divine courts. They worried about the very real, terrifying things that crept slowly and silently out of the dark mud when the small oil lamps finally burned out. They feared the invisible creeping demons that brought sudden hot fevers to their sleeping children, and the malicious wandering spirits that whispered terrible dark nightmares into the ears of the exhausted resting farmers. To completely protect their small, vulnerable families from the absolute terrifying darkness of the long night, the ordinary people did not pray to the beautiful distant gods of the bright sky. The beautiful shining gods of the high sun were far too busy holding the vast universe together to care about a simple human child coughing in a small dark room. Instead, the frightened families turned their desperate prayers to a much older and far uglier pantheon of incredibly fierce protective spirits. They invoked the powerful aggressive magic of the strange grotesque gods who lived in the deep intimate shadows of the actual human home. The absolute most important and most beloved of these fierce domestic protectors was a strange ancient dwarf god named Bez. He was not a beautiful, glowing figure of pure, perfect marble. He was completely grotesque and entirely terrifying to behold. And that was exactly, precisely the entire point of his existence. The ancient families carved the ugly, terrifying face of Bes directly into the heavy wooden legs of their simple beds, and they painted his strange, massive form onto the rough mud brick walls of their small sleeping chambers. His physical image was very deliberately, deeply unsettling, and incredibly aggressive. He had a massive, disproportionate head crowned completely with tall, thick ostrich feathers that made him look wild and untamed. His eyes were incredibly huge, and they bulged aggressively outward, staring directly and unblinkingly at anyone who dared to look closely at him. His tongue protruded, rudely and forcefully, from his wide mouth in a gesture of pure, mocking defiance against the unseen evil forces of the dark. His short, stout body was covered entirely in thick, rough, coarse animal hair that deeply emphasized his wild, primitive, aggressive nature. He carried sharp metal knives and heavy musical instruments that he used to create a terrifying, loud cacophony of noise. This incredibly intimidating and completely ugly appearance was very carefully and highly calculated to entirely frighten away the creeping demons and the malevolent wandering spirits who might attempt to slowly infiltrate the quiet, vulnerable domestic spaces during the dark hours of the night. The placement of these ugly protective images throughout the small Egyptian homes followed very specific, strict magical principles that created multiple invisible overlapping fields of spiritual defense. The most fascinating and deeply intimate use of the image of Bes was carved directly into the hard wooden headrests that the people used for sleeping. In the ancient hot climate, the people did not use soft feather pillows that would trap the sweltering heat and harbor the crawling, biting insects of the dirt floor. They used smooth, curved blocks of solid carved wood that cradled the fragile human neck and kept the vulnerable head elevated safely above the ground. To our modern soft sensibilities, a hard wooden block seems like an incredibly painful and totally impossible way to sleep. But to the ancient, tired worker, the smooth, cool wood resting against the back of the hot, sweating neck was a deep physical relief. And more importantly, the heavy wooden headrest served as a literal, physical, magical shield for the dreaming, vulnerable mind. The ugly, fierce face of Bes was carved deeply into the supporting base of the wooden headrest. This specific placement ensured that his terrifying, unblinking, aggressive gaze watched constantly and vigilantly over the sleeping head of the person throughout the entire long, dangerous night. The ancient people truly believed that human beings were at their absolute most completely vulnerable state when they were fully unconscious and dreaming. The dark, wandering demons of the night specifically preferred to assault their helpless victims when their rational waking minds were temporarily disabled by deep sleep. The carved wooden dwarf god stood like a fierce, loyal guard dog, directly at the fragile gateway of the dreaming mind. To firmly maintain his active, protective presence, the family would place very small, humble offerings of fresh-baked bread and small cups of weak, sweet beer directly beside the wooden headrest before they finally lay down to sleep. They did not offer him massive, sacrificed bulls or pure, solid gold. They offered him the simple, warm, comforting things of ordinary human domestic life. The vulnerable sleeping chambers of the small homes frequently displayed vibrant painted scenes showing the ugly dwarf god engaged in violent, brutal combat with heavy dark serpents and stinging venomous scorpions. These colorful, aggressive paintings were absolutely not mere artistic decorations to make the room look pretty. They were completely functional, active, magical devices that constantly, continuously generated raw protective power through their permanent visual representation. The specific heavy pigments used by the artists to create these wall paintings were carefully mixed with very strange physical substances that held deep protective properties. They crushed the thick shells of massive ostrich eggs into a very fine white powder to represent absolute pure protection. They mixed the paint with ground stable limestone to provide permanent, unyielding strength to the magic. They used bright, vibrant red ochre dirt dug from the deep earth to perfectly represent the hot, beating physical life force that the ugly god was fiercely protecting. But simply painting the ugly face on the mud wall was not completely enough to stop the true terrors of the dark. The physical image had to be forcefully and ritually activated. This required specific, quiet, whispered incantations that literally called the actual living consciousness of the god directly into his physical painted representations. This secret activation transformed the simple carved wood and the dry painted plaster into a truly active, living spiritual guardian. These quiet, intimate activation ceremonies were almost always performed exclusively by the senior older woman of the household. She possessed the deep, generational ritual knowledge entirely necessary to establish the proper firm connection between the wild god and his static image. She would stand quietly in the dark room while the rest of the family prepared for bed. She would whisper the ancient, respectful invitations into the still, warm air. "Come, Bess, the great protector of the small children. Come, Bess, the fierce guardian of the quiet household." The words were spoken softly, but with absolute, total, unwavering conviction. The ugly god was not feared by the family. He was deeply, profoundly, and intensely loved. While the ugly dwarf god fiercely guarded the vulnerable sleeping minds of the family, there was another highly specialized and even more terrifying domestic deity who watched over the absolute most dangerous physical moment in all of human existence. The ancient process of childbirth was an incredibly deadly and deeply terrifying ordeal. It was a time when the invisible, heavy veil between the bright world of the living and the dark realm of the dead became incredibly, terribly thin. To survive this brutal, bloody transition, the frightened women called upon the massive, overwhelming power of Taweret. She was the great hippopotamus goddess, whose incredibly heavy, pregnant physical form perfectly embodied absolute, pure, protective maternal rage. Her strange, terrifying image combined the massive, swollen, heavy belly and the wide, crushing jaws of a female river hippopotamus, with the thick, muscular, deadly limbs of a desert lion and the heavy, spiked, thrashing tail of a massive river crocodile. She was a deeply unsettling composite creature that perfectly incorporated the most absolutely deadly and terrifying qualities of the most formidable wild animals in the entire known world. This highly unusual and completely terrifying physical anatomy was specifically designed to channel the absolute maximum amount of raw, violent protective force directly toward the highly vulnerable sweating mothers and the fragile, screaming infants under her care. The intense preparation for a safe childbirth began many long, anxious months in advance, with the careful creation of small protective amulets featuring her terrifying heavy image. These small charms were carved almost exclusively from the solid white ivory tusks of dead hippos or massive elephants. The ancient craftsmen specifically chose the hard white ivory because they deeply associated the heavy tusk material with the fierce, violent maternal devotion and the crushing protective instincts of the massive wild beasts. When the terrifying pains of actual labor finally began, the small hot birthing chamber was rapidly transformed into a heavily fortified, sacred, magical space. Small baked clay figurines of the pregnant hippo goddess were placed very carefully in the 4 dark corners of the small room. This specific physical arrangement created a completely invisible but entirely impenetrable protective perimeter that the dark, malevolent, creeping spirits of sickness and death simply could not physically cross. The air in the hot, small room grew incredibly thick and suffocatingly heavy, with the strong, pungent smoke of burning protective herbs and roasting crushed resins. The sweating, laboring woman wore the cold, heavy ivory amulets tightly against her bare, heaving chest. The heat of her struggling body warmed the carved bone and activated the deep sleeping magic inside the material. The experienced midwives who assisted during the bloody, terrifying delivery possessed an extensive, deep knowledge of both highly practical physical obstetric techniques and the absolute necessary secret ritual procedures. They were completely essential participants in the highly dangerous magical process of pulling a brand new fragile life out of the dark void and into the breathing world. But sometimes, despite all the carved wooden headrests and the heavy ivory amulets, the dark, creeping things of the night managed to slip silently through the invisible cracks in the magical armor. Sometimes a sudden terrible sickness would violently seize a child, or a deep unnatural madness would completely overtake a resting family member. When the normal, everyday protective magic completely failed, the terrified family had to call for the ultimate heavy weapon against the absolute dark. They called for the specialized priest-magicians known as the Heka practitioners. These specific stern men possessed the incredibly deep, dark, esoteric knowledge and the absolute sheer, terrifying spiritual authority entirely necessary to physically confront the malevolent supernatural forces directly face to face. They were the ancient exorcists of the desert. The arrival of a Heka practitioner at a small, humble mud brick house was a deeply serious and incredibly tense event. These men underwent absolutely grueling, extensive training in the dark, hidden archives of the great stone temples. They learned how to correctly identify the incredibly subtle signs of true demonic possession and how to perfectly distinguish a supernatural magical attack from a simple, ordinary physical illness. They looked closely for sudden, completely unexplainable behavioral changes or completely impossible physical manifestations that entirely defied all natural, rational explanation. Before the stern practitioner could even attempt to confront the dark demon hiding in the house, he had to undergo his own incredibly severe purification procedures. He had to protect his own vulnerable human mind from total catastrophic contamination by the chaotic evil forces he was about to actively engage. He fasted completely for many days, drinking only small amounts of pure, blessed water. He bathed in the harsh, biting natron salt until his skin was red and completely raw. He anointed his own body with highly specialized, thick, foul-smelling oils that were specifically compounded from crushed toxic roots and sharp, bitter resins that the ancient demons supposedly found utterly physically repulsive. The actual physical ritual space for the terrifying exorcism was carefully prepared as an absolute literal spiritual battlefield. The room where the afflicted person lay sweating and trembling was completely cleared of all normal, unnecessary domestic objects. The rough dirt floor was thoroughly washed with strong caustic chemical solutions that entirely eliminated any tiny residual traces of spiritual dirt. The practitioner took a piece of specially consecrated white chalk and began to slowly and deliberately draw complex geometric protective circles directly onto the hard floor. You can hear the dry, rhythmic scratching sound of the hard chalk dragging heavily against the rough stone. It is a slow, deliberate scraping noise that sets the teeth slightly on edge. The thick white lines drawn on the floor created absolute permanent physical barriers that were totally impermeable to the shifting, formless demonic entities. He painted strange, sharp guardian symbols directly onto the mud walls and the low wooden ceiling to completely prevent the attacking dark forces from escaping the room once the violent confrontation truly began. The actual exorcism ceremony involved incredibly complex and deeply dangerous vocal procedures. The practitioner began with very low murmuring invocations that slowly called upon the massive, terrifying power of the major high deities for heavy assistance. He used their borrowed divine authority to completely command the malevolent entity hiding inside the sick person. His low chanting voice gradually increased in sheer, absolute volume and total commanding power. He issued direct aggressive challenges to the possessing demon, demanding that it loudly identify its true secret name. Knowing the true hidden name of a dark spirit gave the human priest absolute total binding control over its chaotic essence. The heavy binding and violent banishment formulas he shouted into the small, hot room drew upon the absolute most powerful and ancient magical traditions preserved in the entire world. His loud, commanding words literally carried the exact same heavy physical creative authority that had originally spoken the entire massive universe into sudden existence. He recited the long, complex formulas with absolute strict attention to the exact proper pronunciation and the precise, heavy rhythm of the syllables. Any tiny, slight deviation or accidental stutter in the traditional vocal patterns could instantly fatally weaken the magical effectiveness of the spell and create a sudden, terrible opportunity for the dark demon to violently attack the Sateracy, mind of the priest. The voice of the man grew incredibly loud and entirely overwhelming in the small, enclosed space. He shouted the final absolute commands that violently, forcefully compelled the dark, malevolent entity to completely depart from the fragile human body and never ever return to the world of the light. The sudden, total silence that immediately followed the loud banishment was incredibly profound and completely exhausting. The heavy, oppressive, crushing atmosphere in the small room instantly completely lifted. The sick, sweating person finally took a deep, clean, peaceful breath of ordinary air. The dark, invisible shadow had been successfully pushed entirely back into the freezing, empty void where it belonged. The small, fragile mud brick house was perfectly safe and completely secure once again. The incredible, terrifying, heavy burden of constantly fighting back the creeping darkness was entirely exhausting for the ancient people. They lived their entire short lives completely surrounded by invisible, creeping threats and massive, towering cosmic responsibilities. But they also possessed the deep, profound, comforting knowledge that they had the actual physical tools and the exact magical words perfectly necessary to completely protect themselves in the dark. They were never truly helpless against the night. You can take that exact same deep, profound comfort into your own quiet, resting mind tonight. You do not need a carved wooden dwarf or a heavy ivory wand to keep you completely, perfectly safe in your own room. The strong, heavy walls of your home are completely secure, and the door is firmly locked against the outside world. The loud, chaotic, demanding noises of the long, busy day have all been successfully banished into the past. There are absolutely no creeping, invisible shadows waiting for you in the corners of your bedroom. The space around your soft bed is a perfectly cleared and entirely secure, peaceful sanctuary. You can completely let go of the need to constantly guard your own tired thoughts. The heavy protective circles have already been permanently drawn, and the quiet, peaceful night is completely safe. Let the slow, heavy, comforting silence of the ancient desert wash entirely over you and pull you gently, steadily down into the deep, warm dark of a truly perfect, dreamless sleep. The protective rituals that safeguarded the small mud brick homes from creeping demons represented only the very outer foundation of a much more elaborate and terrifying magical system. Deep within the absolute darkest and most hidden inner sanctuaries of the greatest stone temples, the senior priests enacted the most profound and transformative secret ceremonies known to the ancient world. These were the sacred hidden mysteries that physically recreated the massive cosmic drama of the death and resurrection of the great god Osiris. These intense dark rituals transcended simple daily protection or the routine feeding of the stone statues. They became an actual, terrifying physical participation in the fundamental heavy forces governing life and death and eternal renewal throughout the entire spinning universe. The dark mythic narrative that provided the deep theological foundation for these secretive ceremonies began in a distant golden age when Osiris ruled the earth as the very first divine pharaoh. He taught the early primitive humanity the high arts of civilization, and he governed the ancient world with perfect, absolute justice and deep, quiet wisdom. His beautiful green kingdom flourished under his gentle divine guidance. The great river flooded at precisely the right times, and the food crops grew in unprecedented heavy abundance. But this primordial perfect harmony deeply aroused the terrible, bitter jealousy of his brother Set. Set was a creature of pure chaos and violent desert storms who simply could not tolerate the quiet stability and the rich prosperity that the divine rule had brought to the green world. The brutal murder of the great king Osiris unfolded through a dark deception of breathtaking, cunning cruelty. During a massive grand feast attended by the high gods, Set presented an exquisitely crafted wooden chest. It was made from incredibly rare, fragrant woods imported from distant lands, and it was heavily decorated with thick, precious metals and glowing raw gems. Set loudly announced to the feasting crowd that this magnificent, beautiful object would be given freely as a royal gift to absolutely anyone who could fit inside its wooden walls perfectly. He turned the dark presentation into a fun, entertaining party game that perfectly masked his true murderous intentions. The wooden chest had actually been secretly constructed according to the exact, precise physical measurements of his brother Osiris. When the great king Osiris willingly lay down inside the beautiful wooden chest to test the fit, Set and his dark conspirators immediately slammed the heavy wooden lid completely shut. They quickly sealed the edges of the wooden box with hot melting lead. The heavy, suffocating smell of the burning, melting metal filled the banquet hall as they trapped the living god inside a completely airtight, dark container that would instantly become his narrow wooden coffin. The conspirators carried the heavy sealed chest to the muddy banks of the Nile and cast it violently into the rushing dark river. The secretive temple priests physically reenacted this primordial murder during the dark season, when the rising waters of the river perfectly recreated the cosmic conditions present during the original ancient crime. The skilled temple workshops constructed incredibly elaborate physical replicas of the deadly wooden chest, using the exact same rare, fragrant woods and heavy, precious materials described in the old sacred texts. The specific priest chosen to carefully represent the murdered god Osiris underwent extensive, grueling physical preparation that very gradually transformed his human consciousness. He fasted for many long weeks and consumed only pure white bread and fresh milk and raw sweet honey. The physical transformation of this chosen priest involved strange cosmetic procedures that completely altered his human appearance. His bare skin was painted entirely with thick, dark green pigments that strongly symbolized both the growing agricultural crops and the promise of eternal life. His soft body was wrapped tightly in rough linen bandages that clearly prefigured his eventual dark mummification. His human face was completely covered with a heavy, solid golden mask that transformed his ordinary identity into a terrifying divine representation. The ceremonial murder took place within a specially prepared dark chamber that perfectly recreated the cosmic environment of the original ancient crime. The floor was completely covered with soft, dry sand that represented the very first primordial mound of earth. The lighting in the room was carefully controlled to create a dim twilight atmosphere that perfectly concealed the treacherous preparations of the actors. The priest representing the chaotic brother Set approached the wooden chest wearing red pigments and a terrifying animal mask. The exact moment when the green-painted Osiris priest climbed into the wooden chest marked the transition from a simple dramatic play to an actual profound spiritual transformation. As the heavy wooden lid closed tightly and the dark seals were applied, the priest trapped inside experienced a terrifying form of ritual death. The absolute pitch-black silence inside the locked coffin was entirely overwhelming. He used deep ancient meditation techniques to slow his own breathing and lower his beating heart rate until he entered a profound trance state that closely resembled actual physical death. The heavy sealed chest was carried slowly through the echoing temple complex in a solemn, dark procession. The barefoot bearers moved with the slow, measured, agonizing pace of a true funeral march. They cast the heavy wooden chest directly into a large, sacred indoor pool that had been constructed to perfectly replicate the rushing flow of the deep river. The priest, trapped alone in the absolute dark of the wooden box, could hear the terrifying muffled sound of the cold water rushing aggressively past the thick wooden planks. The heavy chest floated slowly along the artificial currents. The discovery of the floating body by the mourning goddess Isis initiated the most emotionally powerful phase of the entire mystery ceremony. The priestess, representing the desperate wife, approached the wet chest with slow movements that expressed the raw, agonizing anguish of discovering a murdered, beloved husband. The magical resurrection required the priestess to demonstrate total mastery of the most powerful spoken spells in the entire ancient magical repertoire. She used rare sacred oils to slowly anoint the cold green painted body of the resting priest. The absolute moment of physical resurrection was marked by the priest taking his very first sudden, sharp breath after his long ritual death. The sudden burning intake of fresh air echoed loudly through the dark stone temple chambers, like the very first rushing wind that had stirred the primordial waters of creation. This single sharp breath was the literal physical manifestation of the divine life force returning to a dead body through the sheer power of ancient magic. The heavy, dark spell of death was finally broken, and the warm light of living consciousness rushed back into the cold limbs of the buried man. You can feel the exact same profound sense of returning peace as you rest quietly in your own room tonight. The tight, heavy constraints of the long, difficult day are completely broken open, and the fresh, cool air of the quiet night is filling your tired lungs. You do not need to hide inside a tight wooden box of anxiety or fear. You are completely free to breathe deeply and smoothly in the safe, open dark. Let the incredibly soothing rhythm of your own slow breathing wash away all the lingering shadows of the deep past. The ancient, terrifying mysteries are completely over, and the beautiful, quiet calm of the safe, present moment is waiting to hold you gently. The incredibly transformative mystery plays that revealed the deepest hidden secrets of divine resurrection represented the absolute highest pinnacle of ancient Egyptian religious drama. Yet beyond these theatrical, earthly applications of divine power lay the ultimate profound mysteries that carefully prepared the living human initiates for their own completely inevitable encounter with actual death. The ancient ritual books of the afterlife represented the most deeply sophisticated spiritual technology ever developed by human civilization. These thick, heavy scrolls contained incredibly precise, detailed instructions for safely navigating the highly complex dark geography of the endless underworld. They evolved very slowly, over many long millennia, from simple magical burial formulas carved into the stone walls of the earliest pyramids into massive, comprehensive written guides that mapped every single terrifying aspect of the long, posthumous journey. The physical texts were eventually written down on long, brittle scrolls of woven papyrus. You can almost feel the dry, crumbling texture of the ancient yellowed papyrus unrolling slowly beneath your fingertips. The most elaborate, wealthy versions of these heavy scrolls included highly detailed painted illustrations that showed the exact correct performance of crucial dark rituals and the precise, terrifying appearance of the important underworld, demons. These texts provided the basic incantations for safely leaving the dark tomb and the final heavy formulas for permanently joining the imperishable glowing stars in the eternal black sky. The intermediate spells specifically addressed the massive challenges of the journey, like passing safely through the heavily guarded gates of the night and surviving the terrifying final weighing of the heavy human heart. To fully, completely prepare the living human mind for this terrifying, inevitable journey, the highest priests conducted ultimate mystery rituals that simulated the actual experience of human death. These profound initiations were conducted in the absolute deepest and most secretive hidden chambers of the massive temple complexes. The specific locations were chosen very carefully deep underground to perfectly approximate the cold, dark, crushing conditions of the actual underworld. The long, intense preparation for this mystery initiation began many years before the actual dark ceremony took place. The living candidates engaged in the intensive, quiet study of the afterlife texts, and they practiced deep, isolating meditation techniques that very gradually prepared their human consciousness for the profound, terrifying experiences they would soon undergo. They learned to perfectly recite the essential heavy spells from memory while developing the intense mental discipline completely necessary for maintaining calm awareness during physical states that very closely resembled actual clinical death. The dark underground initiation chamber was carefully prepared as an exact physical replica of the most crucial locations in the terrifying underworld. The heavy stone architecture created the exact strange acoustic and visual conditions described in the ancient accounts of the dark journey. The dim lighting was carefully controlled to perfectly simulate the varying shadowy illumination encountered during the terrifying travel through the lands of the dead. Hidden acoustic chambers and unseen mechanical devices created the terrifying low sounds and the sudden shifting movements that the blindfolded initiates would intensely experience during their symbolic, temporary death. The actual physical initiation ceremony began with the quiet candidate undergoing a complete symbolic death. The living, breathing initiate was carried slowly down into the freezing dark chamber and placed completely alive into a massive, heavy stone sarcophagus. The freezing, unyielding cold of the thick stone box pressed aggressively against his bare back and his bare legs. The senior priests stood around the open stone box and slowly recited the heavy ancient formulas that perfectly described the physical process of human dying. Their low chanting words created the exact necessary psychological conditions for experiencing the deep, terrifying transition of consciousness that accompanies the end of a mortal life. The heavy stone lid was slowly pushed completely shut over the resting initiate, sealing him entirely in the absolute pitch-black dark. Lying perfectly still in the freezing, crushing dark of the heavy stone box, the initiate used his long years of deep meditation training to aggressively slow his own physical bodily functions. He regulated his slow, shallow breathing until it was absolutely barely perceptible to the human eye. He focused his quiet mind and commanded his own beating heart to slow down. The loud, rhythmic thumping in his chest gradually faded into a very slow and incredibly faint, soft flutter. He entered a profound, deep trance state that perfectly hovered on the absolute razor-thin boundary between living consciousness and total death. In this deep, suspended state, he experienced a terrifying simulated journey through the dark regions of the underworld. He encountered specialized priests dressed as the various terrifying deities and the dark guardians of the gates. His interactions with these hidden actors in the dark provided him with the crucial practical experience in the exact recognition and response techniques that would be absolutely necessary during his actual inevitable posthumous travel. The journey through the dark stone chambers was perfectly timed to correspond with the traditional sequence of the long afterlife experiences. He faced the dark terrors of the void, and he successfully recited the secret passwords required to pass through the heavy, unseen gates. The profound resurrection ceremony that finally concluded the long, terrifying mystery initiation involved very gentle, careful procedures that slowly restored the exhausted candidate to a normal waking consciousness. The heavy stone lid of the sarcophagus was slowly pushed aside, and the soft, warm light of the resurrection torches flooded into the dark box. The warm, gentle light slowly pulled his drifting, tired mind back to the physical waking world. The awakening process was incredibly carefully managed to ensure a perfectly smooth, quiet transition from the profound, deep trance state back into normal human awareness. The completed initiate emerged slowly from the cold stone box with a completely new and totally profound, peaceful understanding of human death. He had looked directly into the terrifying, absolute dark void, and he had successfully returned to the warm light of the sun. He was entirely stripped of his mortal fear. The deep psychological effects of this massive mystery initiation extended throughout the entire remaining lifetime of the participant. It provided him with a profound, deep, absolute peace regarding his own inevitable mortality. He understood completely that death was not a violent, terrifying end, but simply a quiet, dark doorway leading to a different kind of eternal, peaceful existence. The fear of the dark was permanently and totally washed away from his mind, leaving only a deep, quiet, beautiful acceptance of the natural cosmic cycle. You can completely share in that exact same deep, beautiful, peaceful acceptance right now as you lie quietly in your own soft bed. You have traveled through the terrifying dark shadows of the ancient world, and you have safely reached the quiet, warm light at the exact end of the long journey. There is absolutely nothing left to fear in the dark shadows of your own quiet room. The heavy stone lids of your daily pressing worries have been pushed completely aside. You do not need to recite any secret complex passwords or face any terrifying dark judgments tonight. The long, exhausting trials of the waking world are completely, entirely finished. The soft, warm blankets covering your tired body are not heavy linen wrappings, but simply the gentle, comforting embrace of the quiet, safe night. The ancient gods have all gone to sleep in the deep sand, and the massive stone temples are completely quiet and perfectly still. Let the slow, steady rhythm of your own calm, beating heart guide you gently downward into the soft, welcoming darkness. The deep, quiet peace of the ancient eternal night is entirely yours to keep. You are completely safe and perfectly calm and totally ready to drift entirely away into the beautiful, dark void of a perfect, dreamless sleep. Good night.